Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about the benefits of ESOPs for businesses and business owners. I've got Robert Powell with me. He's on my team. I'm Bill Kennedy. I'm a shareholder here at Lutz. I've been around for a long time, about 30 years. I'm old, as you can tell, if you're looking at the video. I've got a sling on here. I just had rotator cuff surgery. I'm fine. I'll be around at Lutz here for at least another decade. But I run our at Lutz M&A practice, where we do a lot of work with businesses trying to figure out what to do, selling them, helping them with their transition to their employees or their family, figuring out business valuations and the like. And I've been doing that full time here for probably the last 15 of my 30-year tenure. And we have a group of myself plus 8 others on our team that do this type of work. And Robert's here with me today. He's going to co-present, and he can give you a little about his background.
Yeah, no, my name's Robert Powell. I joined the Lutz M&A team about a month ago. I was actually at Lutz 7 years ago, just in a different capacity. In that meantime, I went to go work for a couple valuation firms where we did predominantly ESOP valuations for ESOP companies. And in that time, I got my certified valuation analyst certification, as well as my associated senior appraiser certification as well. And so glad everyone could be here. And with that being said, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bill and we'll get started.
Okay, before we get into the ESOP details, we kind of want to go through what's going on out there in the world today as we see it. And we're working with a lot of different businesses on different aspects of their strategic plan for their company. But a lot of you have probably heard this. If you've heard me speak before on other topics, I kind of bring this up pretty regularly, that there's a lot of businesses that are where the owners are kind of aging out, meaning they're getting ready to retire. This is baby boomer business owner cycle. And we can tell you from what we see, we work with a lot of smaller businesses up to some pretty good sized ones, but the lower middle market companies, we're seeing a big uptick in the business owners coming to us for this help with trying to figure out what to do. ESOPs are one option of many, but it's pretty important. And a lot of business owners, the key thing here is a lot of business owners don't like the idea of selling to a third party and having all this disruption to their company. And an ESOP, if you're the right type of business, could be a really good option for that type of business owner that has that outlook. So as I said, I've been working with probably hundreds of businesses over the years on what to do with their company, how they want to run through the process. The key to all of this is thinking ahead, planning ahead. It's that simple. There have been a lot of business owners that have come to us kind of when they're ready to kind of walk out the door, and that's really not a good way to get your business ready. So, think through what the goals of transition planning. It's, you got to figure out what you've got, what it's worth. You got to figure out what you want to do. You got to figure out what all your different options are, because you may not have a lot of options depending upon the type of business, the size, etc. Just, kind of educate yourself on what you've got and what you need, and then work towards the goal, whether it's a year down the road or a decade down the road. And what we've seen a lot of is people will talk about this. There's a lot of people on this at this webinar, but actually taking action is sometimes hard for the business owner to do. And the Exit Planning Institute, that's an organization that I've gone through and got a certification from. So have a couple other people here at Lutz. They do a bunch of surveys, come up with a bunch of statistics, and so why do business owners delay exit planning? Well, there's a bunch of different reasons listed around this little circle, but from my experience, fear, and the business owner doesn't like the idea of not owning the business. It scares them. They think they're going to die, whatever it is. That's great, but you kind of need to get over that fear, because one day you're not going to own the business. So don't you want to be in control of that and kind of be educated and have yourself ready? That's really the most important thing. And another thing, it can be overwhelming. Maybe you don't believe it's worth the time or whatever, but That's why you hire people that know what they're doing and have done this before and guided business owners to a good exit. And that's why you do it. Yes, it does cost a little bit of money to do so, consulting with us or whatever it is. But if you think about your personal balance sheet as a business owner and how much of it is tied up in your business, and then think about, well, if you have say you've got an account at a financial advisory firm, you're paying them a percentage of those assets, an asset management fee every year. So in a good analogy would be, shouldn't you be putting some money for asset management of your most important asset? That's kind of the thinking, what we want business owners to start thinking about is putting some time and effort and probably some dollars into this planning process. When we're working with business owners, there's really 4 types. I'll start from the bottom up here. People will come to us saying, I want to sell my business. I need to get out of here now. I want to go retire. I want to move to Mexico. Well, a lot of times those businesses are really worthless because the business owner is way tied into the business. The reason they're burnt out is because they're working too much and they haven't done any planning. That's not a good ESOP target, right? That's not the type of company that can be an ESOP. It's really not a type of company that's very easy to sell for a decent price. There's companies that are in big time growth mode, usually maybe younger ownership or ownership group and really focused on growing the business. Again, probably not an ESOP candidate. Not to say it couldn't be, but usually not. You might see a company like that go out to private equity to try to get some money to help them grow faster, but they're generally not an ESOP candidate. Now, the top 2 could be a good potential candidate where the business owner is ready to be retired but wants to keep working. That's a good ESOP candidate. And then a business owner that really has put into place a management team. They're really not needed day to day, don't really want to work, but they're okay having a little bit of involvement. Those are the 2 types of owners that we think would be good candidates for ESOPs. This little chart, I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but this kind of shows you the different channels, like the different ways you can sell a company or different types of people you could sell to. We're going to focus today on employees. So if you're going to sell to employees, ESOP is a great option. You can just have a management buyout where you're only selling to a handful or maybe just one individual employee as a buyer. And then there's kind of offshoots of that where you put in incentive plans where they can earn ownership in the company through like phantom stock plans or stock appreciation right type plans. That's usually how a business is transferred to employees. And again, you can refer back to this chart for kind of the other areas or ways to do it and kind of help you start thinking through it a little bit. So when it comes to if you're going to sell your company, right? Take a step back. There's really 3 ways to sell your business. You're either going to sell it to a third party, you're going to sell it to some group of your employees, or you're going to have a sale to family. Those are typically the 3 ways that we see businesses transferring. If it's not one of those 3, it's usually like a bankruptcy or liquidation, and hopefully that's not where you're going to go. It's more ideal to have one of those 3 ways to do it. So what's the difference between selling to an ESOP versus a third party? There's a few. They're not that much difference. Probably the key area where it's a little bit different is really the sale price. If you go out and market your company and find a strategic buyer in your industry that wants to come in and either take on new territory or just swallow up your customer list, they might be willing to pay a pretty high multiple for your business. Whereas if you sell to an ESOP, there's rules for what the value can be, right? As typically you're hiring a third party appraiser as fair market value. So there's a difference between a strategic value and fair market value. Sometimes a business owner is okay with that because of some of the benefits that we're going to talk about later in this presentation. The good things about an ESOP versus selling to a third party. But sometimes that dollar difference can be pretty significant and keep you away from it. But that's probably the number 1 difference. When you look at these other little areas, the document requirements, pretty similar between selling to a third party, selling to an ESOP. The costs, generally, if you hire a M&A advisor to market your business, you're going to pay a lot more to sell it to a third party. Again, you're going to get a higher price than an ESOP. You're still going to have quite a bit of fees setting up an ESOP. The year you set it up and then ongoing, there are fees. But again, the benefits generally outweigh the cost there. The time to get an ESOP deal done versus a sale to a third party, pretty similar. Contingencies, a lot of times if you're selling to a third party, there can be some contingent earnout type pieces to the sale. You don't usually see that in an ESOP. I've already gone through the valuation difference. One of the big positives or things that can come into play on an ESOP sale versus a third party is you can sell a partial interest to an ESOP. Usually it's you want to get a significant amount. 30% is kind of the usual minimum, but sell 30% to an ESOP to kind of get it going. Owners are still involved. Sell the other 70% either to the ESOP, or you can still sell it to a third party at some later point, still have control over the business. There's some difference on taxes, and we have a few slides on the tax situation here that we'll go through later, but there's really not a huge difference. The biggest difference would really probably be that sale price. So I think Robert now is going to go through some of these slides with us.
Yeah. So when you're selling a company, what exactly is the owner looking for? We have a few bullets here that we want to run through. I think to start off, you're obviously going to be looking for, to get the most money. As an owner, you put your blood, sweat, and tears into building up a company. Obviously, you want to get the biggest bang for your buck. An owner may also want to continue running the business, but to diversify their estate and investments. And then once you get to that point where you're looking into, doing a sale, you don't necessarily want to have all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. So should you choose to, sell a portion of your company or whatever it may be, you can, use those proceeds to diversify, into any other investment vehicle. So you choose. An owner may also want to keep control as long as possible and delegate along the way. And what we mean by this is that you don't necessarily have to sell your company 100% outright and just be done. You can actually sell in tranches, kind of like what Bill was just saying with the minority interest. And that kind of gives you the flexibility to, still maintain your role and slowly step away, whenever the time is right for you. An owner also might look to leaving a legacy. And, what we kind of mean by that is, for example, let's say that, you start a company and you build it into this, this great operation, and you're at that point now where you want to turn it over. You want to see that company still succeed and do well. And so I think this is where an ESOP would come into play very well, just because you're giving it back to the employees or the management team that, kind of been there with you along the way, rather than doing, selling it to a third party that may not have an understanding of, what exactly it is that you built. So that's something to keep in mind too. Another item that an owner may want is to maintain family harmony. Unfortunately, when families, and business gets involved in selling, things can kind of get a little convoluted. So we think it's prudent to, have those conversations early, talk to your spouse, your children, whoever it may be, and just, kind of get on the same page, be transparent, just so, they can, more or less have a comfort level that, things are fair, the sales fair, just trying to prevent that potential issue, kind of down the road. So it's always nice to kind of think about that ahead of time. An owner may also want to pay as little taxes as possible. Obviously, this is where ESOPs come into play. There's good tax incentives involved, which, as Bill alluded to, we'll get to a little later on in the presentation. And an owner may want to pass on to employees, which is exactly what an ESOP would be used for. So I think those are key things to kind of think on.
One thing too, we forgot to mention at the beginning, if you have questions on any of these slides, hit us up right in the middle of it. We'll pull them up and handle them as we go, as opposed to waiting to the end. It might be more effective that way.
Yeah. So another issue that we want to, kind of point out that we think it's, prudent for business owners to, think on, not only, what are you looking for, but, what are some issues that you may face when you're thinking about selling? First being, you may not know how much you need to retire. This actually happens quite often, I feel like. So this is where it makes sense, have that conversation with your spouse, your tax planner, financial planner, accountant, or whoever it may be, just kind of, get a better understanding of, what your runway looks like. How much do you really need to live out the rest of your life, comfortably. That's an issue that, you should think about. Another one is you may not know the value of the business. Having been doing this for a couple of years now, that's something that I feel like is, we run into quite often. You may, think that your company is worth X because of, you're tied to it, and, you put your blood, sweat, and tears into it. It may have a different value though, and that's why I think it's prudent to, bring on an expert, bring on, professional, evaluator that, can walk you through, make you really understand, okay, this is what it's worth, this is why it's worth that, here's, where we think things can be going, just kind of walk you through the process and, more or less kind of give you a better understanding of how someone is, a buyer is going to view your company. Another issue is, you may want to make sure that the employees are taken care of, but you also want to get the maximum price for your business. This ties in perfectly well with an ESOP, meaning that, obviously you want to make the most bang for your buck, but, you want to have that loyalty to your employees. So you want to make sure, hey, I'm not just selling you guys off to a third party and like, see you later, riding off to the sunset. You want to make sure like, hey, you guys are set, and, the ESOP kind of gives that comfort of, giving it back to the team that was there that, built the company into what it is today. Another issue is, you may want to remove yourselves from the risk of business ownership, such as, bank guarantees or any contingencies that you may have in place. And last, another issue is, if it is a family or an employee sale, you may be uncertain on, exactly how you want to split that ownership. Whether it's 50-50 or, you have like, a kid coming in to inherit it, or, whatever the case may be. It makes sense to have that conversation ahead of time, kind of, prevent falling into any of those pitfalls, that may come down the road. So that's something that it's critical to think about too.
Yeah, just to add on to that, that whole idea of this planning and kind of thinking through it, all these things, almost every single one of them comes into play when we start talking to a business owner about what they're going to do. And, those are pretty key points that you got to really think through, and you're going to need some help.
Exactly. Yeah. So in essence, we believe those are great ideas, kind of, get a better understanding that as you start going through this process, and, the earlier you can do it, the better. So having said that, one avenue an owner can go about, selling their business is to sell to an ESOP. And so we'll cover that, obviously, the remainder of the presentation. So a little bit of a background, kind of, what an ESOP, what they are, what they entail. So there's approximately about 6,500 companies that sponsor an ESOP. That includes both private and public companies. So that amounts to about 14 million employees and approximately 8% of the workforce in America. And, ESOPs have been increasing in popularity, I'd say, definitely over the last couple of years. It's definitely a successful way to transfer ownership to, to your employees. Like I said, you're transferring to someone that was, there with you, that, built the company to where it is now. And they basically, they typically have a beat on, how the company is run, and how the company is viewed on, in the community itself. And so this chart, I thought it was kind of important to show that, ESOPs are everywhere. I mean, it's not necessarily like tied down to, oh, if you're only in this industry, you can do an ESOP. So I think it was prudent to kind of show, hey, ESOPs are, they're in a wide range or a lot of sectors. Obviously, the top four kind of being, concentrated, but, over my last, 7 years working in the ESOP world, I've seen ESOPs, in the, obviously the manufacturing, construction, wholesale, the medical field. Believe it or not, I actually did an ESOP for funeral homes, so that was a little different. But I think it's just important to show that, as ESOPs are gaining popularity, I think that this chart is only going to expand and fluctuate. So, just because you're in a certain sector doesn't necessarily mean that, like, oh, we can't really do an ESOP. You can do an ESOP, wherever you may be. So I thought that was important to show. So what is an ESOP? By definition, the ESOP is a qualified defined contribution employee benefit plan that invests primarily in the stock of the sponsoring company. to kind of break this out into, two steps, an ESOP does invest primarily in employer securities. A qualified plan, what exactly is a qualified plan? Qualified retirement plan is just a plan that, meets certain requirements of the Internal Revenue Code. Defined contribution plan, those are retirement plans of those that accumulate contributions to accumulate a benefit that is not defined in advance, unlike a defined benefit plan. So in a sense, it's kind of a variation of a stock bonus money purchase pension plan. And lastly, it is also the only type of an employee benefit plan that can borrow money from the employer. So what are some of the benefits of an ESOP, and why is it something that an owner should look into selling into? So to start, an ESOP can be used to increase and raise capital, and this can be funded with the existing retirement plan. It also can increase productivity, profitability, and cash flow. And I thought it would be a good thing to bring up. I found an interesting study that was provided by the National Center of Employee Ownership, or the NCO for short. They stated that on average, employees that work in an ESOP company have somewhat higher wages than employees that are not in an ESOP company, but they also have 3 times the amount of company-related retirement assets, which is a huge gift to employees, really. In addition, a part of the study that I thought was kind of critical to show is that the study saw that ESOP companies grew about 2 to 3% faster per year than would have been expected if they weren't an ESOP. And for those companies that totally embraced the ownership culture, they actually saw a 6 to 11% increase had they not been an ESOP. So one thing I think is critical to kind of keep it in mind when potentially going to an ESOP is there's a lot of tangible and intangible assets that can form value. So I thought that was kind of key to bring up. Another benefit of an ESOP is should you choose to take the S Corp route, you pay no federal income tax, which obviously is a huge perk. We'll get into this a bit later once we go through the tax incentives. And then another thing that an ESOP can do is it can increase stock value, increase expansion, improve employee morale, and it can cause greater employee involvement. I think these all 4 kind of tie in together and kind of go back to really what that NCO study was saying is, these employees that, buy into this ownership culture, they kind of see it as, this is my baby now. The harder I work, the bigger retirement that I can have. So I think those 4 bullets, kind of all tie in together that, if you embrace it, I think your employees will embrace it as well. So continuing on, some additional benefits that an ESOP will have towards the company is it can be an ideal recruiting tool. I've personally seen, people that have stuck around and they've had significant payouts, because the longer you stay, the higher your retirement's going to be. So, if you're trying to bring in some candidates, you say, hey, we have an ESOP, I think that is definitely an intriguing tool that you can use. An ESOP also creates a market for stockholders who wish to sell their shares. So one of the items that if you choose to do an ESOP route, one of the things that is required by the DOL is to have an annual valuation. And so by doing so, an independent third-party valuation firm comes in and puts a value on the company. And so that kind of allows each year. And so that allows, should you leave or retire or whatever it may be, it kind of gives comfort to those stockholders that, this is a fair value for my shares. Another benefit is it can reduce the turnover and reduce the employment insurance premiums. And this kind of ties into kind of what I was saying a little bit earlier that, the longer that you are there as an employee, the more rewards that you can reap. And so that drastically, reduces the turnover rate and allows, for that reduced turnover and the lower insurance premiums as well. Another benefit is it can be a vehicle for the orderly transition of management and employees. And so what exactly do we mean by that? We just mean that, some members of the management team can choose to stay on if they want to choose to. You don't necessarily have to, get up and leave. You don't have to sit there and say, hey, I'm going to sell this company and I'm gone. You can choose to stay if you want. You can have a certain runway, you can stay a couple of years, whatever it may be. So it's a nice vehicle to do that. It's also an alternative to selling the company to outsiders, and that kind of allows you to keep the jobs in the community. This kind of ties back into when you're selling it back to the employees, they kind of have a beat on the company and what it means to the community, whereas you may sell it to a third party, they may not really understand what exactly the company stands for. So you kind of have that, I guess, comfort level that you're selling it back to someone that actually has the same values in mind that you do. Another benefit is it's a means to reward loyalty with equity without creating additional stockholders. I think that's kind of exactly what an ESOP stands for. And then lastly, it can provide a vehicle for long-term growth through acquisitions. So if a company decides to choose that route, the way they do that is, you'd basically be financing the acquisition through the loan that buys the stock from a leveraged ESOP. And so that's we can get into a little more details about that a little bit later.
Let me tag onto that. Yeah. So what you see, like companies in town, HDR, for instance, is an ESOP. And when a company does an ESOP and it gets the term used mature, meaning they paid off most of their debt from the initial transaction going to an ESOP, especially if they're an S Corp, which again, we're going to talk a little bit more about, but the S Corp earning dollars and not having to pay tax. If you're an S Corp now, distribution goes out for taxes to the owners to pay tax. Well, you don't have to do that. So the money stays in the company, and it's kind of a super fund for expansion after you've kind of become a mature ESOP. So that's what you see from some of these companies like HDR. Travel and Transport was that way prior to their sale a few years back, but they had become mature. They were profitable businesses. So what they do with their profits, they went out and expanded by acquisition.
So let's take a look at, kind of what are the benefits for the selling shareholder. Obviously, the gain is potentially tax deferred, tax free. That's something that we're going to get into a little bit later. Another benefit is it could be used as a vehicle for succession planning. It also could, you have the ability, the owner to have the ability to sell stocks in stages and control the timing of the ownership transition, which I believe is a huge perk for, that an ESOP offers is, instead of selling everything at once, saying, okay, this is what I'm doing, goodbye, you could sit there and say, I only want to sell in, a certain amount, sell it in tranches, so to speak. That kind of allows you to really, gradually ease out of your ownership role through time. And then as you're doing that, you kind of, get the team in place. So that I think that's a big perk. Another benefit is you have the ability to continue to control the entity during the process. So kind of tagging on to that, you don't necessarily have to give up full control. If you sell, you can still be the majority owner. You can sell in tranches, 25%, 50%, whatever it may be. So you still have that control. And you could choose, just, do you want to write off from the sunset now, or do you want to, give it 3 years, 4 years, whatever it may be, or, hey, I'm just not ready to retire, I'm going to stay on. It's just whatever works for you and the company. Another benefit is ESOP transactions are confidential and they are less disruptive than a sale to a third party. They can also reward employees for their loyalty, which kind of goes back to what we've been stating. And it can create a legacy and maintain the company and community, which again is exactly what we're going back. You're giving it back to the employees. And so the firm kind of stays, has that community feel still. And then, tagging on to the other bullets that we were just talking about, you can sell minority interest, which I think is a big perk in selling to an ESOP, is that, like we were saying, you don't have to sell it all out at once. You can sell 2%, 3%, whatever it may be. However, I do think it's prudent that when you do decide to go down that route, talk to your advisors, because certain tax incentives, aren't applicable if you only sell a certain amount. Like 100%, you obviously have different tax incentives than if you sell 30% or 5% or whatever it may be. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Plus, you want it to be significant because the cost of maintaining an ESOP are fairly high. So having a 5% ESOP ownership usually wouldn't make very much sense unless you're like a big public company.
Correct. And last but certainly not least, what are benefits for, from an ESOP for the employees? The first one being, low likelihood that the company is sold to an outsider. I think this kind of gives the employees, a sense of job security, saying, hey, we don't have, some third party that doesn't know what we're about coming in and saying, hey, like, bought your company, it's not working out, like, we're going to strip assets. I mean, that does happen. So it's that comfort level of, hey, we're keeping it, more or less in the family. I think it does a lot for job security and just kind of letting employees know that, hey, the owner does care about you, does care about this company. It also brings greater financial security for retirement, kind of as we've been stating. It also gives them greater involvement and pride in their company through a sense of ownership. And I think this kind of ties into that NCO study saying that, if you tie into the ownership culture, these employees will see it as, hey, like, rather than having, the typical 8 to 5 job, like, this actually means something to me. I want to, I want to build this company into something big so I can retire and, have a fat paycheck at the end of the year or end of the, once I retire. So I think that's also a big benefit. It also has, the greater ability to, affect their own wealth and ability to feel like owners, kind of what we were stating. And then the last bullet, fairness determined by independent valuation. One of the steps that you will do if you do choose to sell to an ESOP is you'll have a trustee come on board, and the trustee's pretty much sole job is to look out for the employee and the participant's interest. And one of the things that they need to do is bring on a third-party independent valuation firm to do an annual valuation each year. And so that by doing so, that gives the employees a kind of sense of, hey, this is the right amount. I'm not being screwed here. So it just allows them to feel more comfortable that this is what it's worth. So that's also a perk. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bill, and we'll get to talk about some tax incentives.
Okay, so we've been referring to these tax incentives, and there's quite a few of them. We'll run through them here. One of the questions that gets asked a lot is, so how does this work for an employee? If you're an employee in an ESOP, how does it work? Well, how do I earn shares? Robert mentioned that this is like a qualified plan, so they kind of vest in their shares, but they earn it basically their percent of their salary as a percentage of the total company compensation, total payroll. That percent of value growth is what they earn in their account. Now, there's way more details into that, but that's the gist of how it works. So if your salary is 1% of the total salaries of the company, you'll get 1% of the shares over time, right? That simplistically. So what does that mean? They're shares. Well, it's just a kind of record keeping. It's not actual ownership by the individual, because the ESOP itself, which is a trust, owns all the shares, and you over time earn a chunk of the value that the ESOP has. And that dollar value that you earn over time, when you take it out, when you retire, you can roll it over into an IRA. It's effectively a retirement account, treated just like a 401k or an IRA. So it's taxed when you actually take it out to use it. It's taxed at ordinary rates. So you're not going to get capital gain treatment on this as an employee, but you're also not paying anything for it. Another thing that usually comes up is, okay, well, a company that does an ESOP, most companies have a 401k plan. So what do you do if you do an ESOP? The company was making contributions to the 401k, and now they've got to make contributions to effectively get money to the ESOP to pay the debt off. So how does that work? Typically, most companies will stop their 401k matching for a period of time, kind of until they've matured, and then bring it back into where they're doing both. But you'll still have 401k plan in place where the employees can defer into it. So that's a key thing. So the employees still have a 401k. There may not be a company match, because at least at first, because you've now done an ESOP. Most of the ESOP deals that we've worked on here at Lutz are S corps. Robert, in his career of doing only ESOP valuations, is probably seeing a lot of both. But if you are a C corp, you effectively get to deduct the payment on the loan for the ESOP transaction, and that's you don't get to do that if the company redeems a stockholder with a bank note, you don't get to deduct the payment. So that's a little bit of a benefit. Again, we're not seeing a lot of C corps, but if you are, that's a nice benefit. Another thing here is that if you're a C corp, you can actually contribute shares at whatever the market value of those shares are and get a tax deduction for it. With the S corps, what you usually see as a cash contribution to the plan before the deal closes. So it effectively gives some ownership to the, some value to the employees day one, just so there's a little something there for them. Other things with the C corp, they can deduct dividends that are used to pay down debt or go into shareholder accounts. So there's some nice benefits if you're a C corp, but I'd say the bigger benefit is being an S corp, because the S corp pays no income tax. That has been talked about a little bit here. It's a pretty big deal. So before I go into the more details on that, the owner, if you're a C corp, the owner can actually defer, kind of like a like kind of exchange on real estate. They can defer the gain on the sale if you're selling a C corp, if you sell at least 30% of the company to an ESOP. There's some rules for how that money gets reinvested, but that could be a pretty big deal if that's the route you're going. I mean, a lot of times the business owner wants the cash for retirement, so having to reinvest it in something that's locked up may not be a great answer, but it's still a pretty unique perk that's out there for the right company and the right owner. But back to the S corp thing. So ESOP. So let's say you're 100% owned by the ESOP and you're an S corp, and the company makes $2 million a year. Usually, $800,000 of that would have gone to taxes through the owner, passed through to the owners as income, and they've got to pay personal income tax on it. The S corp pays no income tax. There's no flow through to a taxable entity, and ESOP is a tax-free entity. So all that money can be used to pay down the debt from the transaction. So banks have really started to catch on to this and really like to finance ESOP deals. You're not going to get 100% financing typically from a bank, but if you think about how simple it would be when you get to keep 100% of your profits to pay down debt, the cash flow models banks are putting together to look at these deals, it gives them a lot of comfort. So that's a really huge reason why we see a lot of these happening and a lot of banks starting to play ball with ESOPs. Another thing from a tax perspective that could be really important in a particular type of business. So when you sell to an ESOP, you are selling your stock, right? So you get capital gain treatment on the sale of the stock. You can typically, if you're a Nebraska company and full Nebraska income, it can be structured to where you pay no Nebraska tax on the gain on the sale, and then you're left at the 20% capital gain rate, and that's it. The other thing to think about here, if you're a business that is a cash basis taxpayer, and there's a lot of those out there, like professional services companies, even some construction businesses. If you're a cash basis taxpayer, there's usually a big deferred tax. So let's say meaning you haven't paid tax on any of your receivables. So you may have a lot of receivables, not very much in payables because you're a cash basis taxpayer. So let's just make up a number. You've got $10 million in receivables and your cash basis. If you sell to an ESOP, that deferred tax on the $10 million for being cash basis goes bye-bye. It's gone. So that right there is a huge, huge deal for the seller of a company. If you sell that company to a third party, usually a sale to a third party is structured as a asset sale. You're going to have to pick up that $10 million of receivables that you sold to the buyer and pay ordinary income tax on. So that's basically $4 million savings right there. It's a huge deal. Same thing if you're a equipment heavy business. So a lot of contractors we have quite a few contractor ESOP clients. And if you're equipment heavy, you've probably written off depreciated bonus depreciation, Section 179. You've done that with all your equipment. So again, if you sell to a third party and it's structured as an asset deal, they're going to value your equipment at whatever it's worth at the time. And since you've fully depreciated, that amount that's allocated to the equipment is going to be taxed at ordinary rates. It's called depreciation recapture. You sell to an ESOP, nope, no depreciation recapture. It's all at that capital gain rate. So those are two things that are kind of hidden gems of doing an ESOP transaction from a tax perspective. Okay, so if you are looking for CPE. There's a polling question, so we're going to take a slight break here so people can get their CPE if they want it.
One more.
Okay, back at it here.
Alrighty, so what's the applicable law when dealing with an ESOP? Obviously, you have to deal with the IRS that oversees the ESOPs to ensure that the ESOP does not acquire company stock at prices in excess of fair market value, and that the corporate deduction for contributions to the ESOP is proper. And then in the other department that you have to deal with is the Department of Labor. This deals with fiduciary responsibilities that are administered and enforced by the DOL. And in general, the DOL is concerned that the ESOP is implemented for the exclusive benefit of participants in financial fairness.
Yeah, and then, so this is the pain factor of doing ESOP. You got to deal with these organizations, but and there have been quite a few cases where, not around here, but there's been a lot of court cases where a business owner has kind of done a shady job of setting up an ESOP. So there's a fair amount of attention from these organizations on ESOPs, but as long as you do it right and you know, kind of do what we're talking about here, the way we're going to talk about how they're structured, you shouldn't have any type of problem at all.
So how exactly does one go about creating an ESOP? And really the answer is it depends. You can have a non-levered ESOP, a leveraged ESOP. There could be bank financing, seller financing, a mix of everything. It really just depends. And so that I think that's why it's important to kind of have that conversation early in the process, just so there's an understanding of, okay, how exactly is this going to get funded? And so having said that, in order to get the ESOP, the company creates the Employee Stock Ownership Trust. And this is funded by contributing the company shares, contributing cash to buy company shares, and then having the ESOP borrow money to buy shares, and then making the payments to the trust to repay the loan. It's also important to note that the employees or the participants, they don't directly hold or buy the shares through the plan. Instead, the plan trustee buys, holds, and sells the shares in the trust name for the benefit of the employees. And just some kind of generic details of what you have to deal with participation wise. It's very participation requirements very similar to the 401k. You have to be 21 and older, have at least 1,000 hours or more in a year, 1 year of service, and it may exclude certain individuals such as non-resident aliens and union employees. And I also did want to point out that I have worked on multiple ESOPs over the past couple of years that have had a union base. So if you have a union, doesn't mean that you're disqualified from having an ESOP. It just means that those employees that are within that union base just can't participate in the ESOP itself. But the other employees that may not be in the union can surely participate. So I just want to point that out. All right, and kind of as discussed earlier by Bill, there's obviously some significant tax incentives for S corps. So we just wanted to kind of dive in a little bit more and just kind of explain what exactly what it looked like. So an S corp, you can only have one class of stock and no more than 100 stockholders. And so if you're sitting there saying, hey, I got 300 people, like obviously I can't do an S corp. That's not necessarily true, because the trust itself is treated as the single stockholder. So you only have one stockholder, so you don't have to worry about being out of compliance with the RZU code. Another thing, if you do choose to go the S corp route, you don't have the Section 1042 tax deferral available. This is a tax incentive, kind of briefly touched on that a C corp can do. But I did want to point out that there was an act, I think it was this year, I think it was called like the MOVE Act. Starting in 2028, they are allowing S corps to take the Section 1042 tax deferral, but as of right now, it's only for 10% of the proceeds. So it's not much, but it's at least moving in the right direction. Getting Congress and the IRS to kind of implement these changes can take a while. So at least there's movement. So, maybe in a couple of years, it could be a good thing.
And the 1042, for those not familiar, it's like the 1031 for real estate. That's that deferred tax rollover deal. That's what the 1042 is for an ESOP versus a 1031 for real estate.
Yep. And then the last bullet point here, kind of as previously stated, to the extent that the ESOP owns the shares in an S corp, the ESOP does not pay taxes on the pass-through distributions of taxable income. So that's a critical piece. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bill, and we'll get wrapped up.
Yeah, that last point we've said like 5 times, but that is a huge deal here, and that's why these come into play, and we're talking to a lot of clients about it, because it provides a lot of comfort level for the business owner that the company is going to be able to pay whatever loans it has from doing the transaction, because they have tax-free income for probably 5 years before they're ever having to make payments out to an ESOP participant for retirement, because it takes a while for the employees to get a significant amount of value in their accounts. So there's a lot of cash flow available for debt service. So ESOP candidate characteristics. We got a bunch of them listed here. I'll kind of focus on the key ones that I think matter the most. The company itself needs to be, not heavily leveraged. A really debt-heavy business will have trouble getting additional bank financing to do an ESOP deal. Maybe you could do a seller financed one, but again, that's a lot of debt on the balance sheet. So heavily leveraged companies are not great. You need a strong management team. We beat that into people's heads when it comes to any type of sale. But when you go through the process of doing an ESOP, you, the business owner, will hire a trustee. And that trustee is actually not working for you, he's working for the employees. That trustee then hires the valuation person, and they'll hire a law firm, right? And you as a business owner seller, you're paying for all of that. Then you'll usually hire us or somebody like us to represent you and help you through the transactions. And you're paying us too. So the business owner has to pay a lot of people in this process. The trustee is going to be like a third party buyer, and they're not going to want to buy a company that you, the seller, want to retire day one, and there's not good people there, and you're working 60 hours a week and you just want to leave and get your ESOP money and go away. They're going to make sure there's a good management team, or they're not going to pay very much for your company to do the ESOP. So a strong management team is really important. Kind of a steady track record. It doesn't have to be perfect, but really choppy up and down type profitability business would be tough to do an ESOP. Hard to value those types of companies. Probably wouldn't get what you wanted for it. Those are pretty important. And I'll again state that if you are a company that is cash basis and or heavy equipment, that isn't heavily leveraged, that's a really good candidate for an ESOP, because if you're larger, the tax savings on that could be millions of dollars. It could kind of make up a big chunk of the difference between selling to an ESOP or selling to a strategic party, third party. From a selling stockholder standpoint, best characteristics, I would say, one, and we see this a lot when we talk to business owners, they want to reward their employees. This is a good way to reward the employees for helping them build up all the value in their company. So having that desire, which is pretty common, is good. Wanting to stay involved a little bit after the sale, or maybe a lot after the sale, and kind of still maintain kind of control of the day-to-day operations, that's a good characteristic for a ESOP sale. And I say interested in carrying some of the financing, well, that's going to be imperative that you carry some of the financing. I mean, the normal way an ESOP transaction is structured is a bank will loan, call it 30-40% of the value to the company to fund the transaction. So you get 30 to 40% of the value down without having to personally guarantee any of the company's debt. I mean, that's one of the things that selling shareholder wants. You want off the hook. You're de-risking. You don't want to be on the debt anymore. Okay, so you're not on the bank debt, but you're going to carry the other 60 to 70% of that business sale. So you still have risk, obviously. If the company tanks, you may not get your money. Whereas if you sell to a third party, you could probably get most, if not all of it, up front. But then you lose the control, and who knows what happens to your company. So these are the things that we talk through with business owners to try to figure out which route to go down. But if you're still going to stay heavily involved, and you'll get a decent interest rate on your as there's other ways to kind of there's stock warrants and things like that the selling shareholder can get on his note to help share in the value as the company grows over time, and basically still kind of running the company. You'll have a board. There's some governance involved, but those are really, if that's interesting to you as a business owner, you should talk to us, because those are those last three things on the list of the selling stockholder. That is, if you really like those three things, then an ESOP should be discussed. But again, back to the company side though, here's another thing that I didn't mention. The 50 employees, that's my number, our number for a good 50 full-time equivalent employees where there's not a lot of turnover. I'm sure Robert has seen quite a few less than that. I've only seen a couple and they didn't go very well. But you generally want to be a pretty good sized business. I would say at a minimum, $5 million business value, equity value to do it, probably closer to 10, but 50 employees. So if you're a smaller business, 20 employees, may not be right. Still worth having a conversation, but usually it's tough to make it worthwhile in those types of businesses.
Full questions if you want to take.
Oh yeah, take some questions.
Read them.
Yeah.
Any scenarios where an ESOP does not make sense?
Well, any scenarios where an ESOP does not make sense, that kind of goes back to, well, you don't have enough employees, might be a debt, a debt heavy business that doesn't make sense. Types of businesses, you could be any type of business and be an ESOP, but it's usually you get disqualified by being too small or being too leveraged with bank debt already. Next question.
Bonding company hurdles for a general contractor on a leveraged ESOP for 100% of the company.
Well, so we've done quite a few contractors, businesses that have to do bonding. So the bonding companies understand ESOPs, and they treat that debt kind of like it's subordinated debt. So bonding companies generally understand it. So that the piece I was talking about, the 60-70% that the selling owners will have to carry, that's subordinate to the bonding company and all that. So it generally works. The bonding companies understand it, and you're not going to have a problem. Although it does, you need to have the conversation with them before you get too far down the path, just to make sure they understand it. Because your balance sheet, when you do an ESOP transaction, it turns your balance sheet upside down. I mean, it'll probably take your equity on your balance sheet negative throughout the way it all works. So, the normal bonding capacity, 20 times equity and all that, kind of go out the window. So conversations with bonding companies early in the process is important.
Is there a minimum percentage that can be sold to an ESOP, or is it just a matter of the cost outweigh the benefit if it is too small of a percentage?
Well, the only place where there's a pure minimum is if you're a C Corp and you're the selling shareholder and you want to do that tax deferral, got to be 30%. I have not seen one or worked on one for less than 30%. I have done some 30% deals, and they weren't even C Corps, they were S Corps. But it does come down to really the cost benefit. I mean, going through and doing an ESOP can cost cost over $100,000 for sure to set one up, and then you're probably paying. You got to pay the trustee, the third party trustee. You've got to pay a plan administrator, you got to pay a valuation company to do a valuation every year. If you're over 120 employees, you'll have to do a audit of your ESOP, kind of like an audit of a 401k plan. So that stuff can add up to 50,000 plus recurring fees a year. So does it make sense to do a 5%, 10% ESOP when you know you're going to have those expenses? Usually not. You want it to be a significant transaction and a significant part of the business, and really a significant part of the whole strategic plan for the company. You know, if you're going to do an ESOP and you're going to do, maybe it works to do, you're going to do 10% of the ESOP for 10 years and that's your plan and you're okay with the fees, but normally you're going to see a bigger chunk at the initial transaction.
Last one, are the high interest rates creating an issue in valuations?
They are. I mean, in general, valuations, especially these types, are going to come down because, you know, it's simple math. The company's making, it was easier for the company to pay off the ESOP loan when interest rates were 3% versus 7%, right? So yes, but on the other hand, you know, we're doing third-party sale transactions. We've seen the pricing come down a little bit from what it had been, but really not a heck of a lot. So it is an issue. Might take longer to pay the ESOP off, but you can probably still get a decent value. It's not gonna, you know, it didn't get cut in half or anything like that. So this next slide, using ESOP and exit planning. You know, we've talked about this, and I just kind of went through some of this, how it kind of works, steps to setting it up. The feasibility analysis, that's usually somebody like us helping to figure out what the company is worth, how educating you on how it would work, maybe working with some other experts in this world to figure out, okay, a bank would loan 20%, only 20% of this one, or they might give you 50% of this one without a personal guarantee, just kind of figuring all that stuff out. You know, I didn't mention before, you'll hire you hire the trustee who hires a valuation person and a lawyer, but then you'll also have to hire an ESOP attorney to put together your ESOP plan and work with the employee side, the trustee side attorney on doing the whole deal. So you're paying a lot of professionals. That's why it costs so much. So, you know, you'll go through it with the bank too. So getting the bonding company and the banks involved pretty early is a good move. There are some banks that focus in the area of ESOPs. And there are other banks that haven't been focused on it, but have really gotten into it because of the thing we talked about, where they figured out that an S ESOP is a really good loan candidate because of the lack of having to pay tax. So, I mean, that's really that part of it. But when we said earlier on, it takes 6 to 12 months, it's because you're doing all these documents. You're still doing a sale transaction. There's all these things to go through, setting up the ESOP plan itself, and it takes doing the valuations and all that. It takes a while. There's a lot to it. It's a little bit cumbersome, and really, you know, afterwards, after you do an ESOP, there's going to be more just corporate governance that you probably haven't been used to. You know, for some business owners, they really don't like it. You're going to have a board, right? Probably going to have some of your key people on it. That third-party trustee is not on your board, but generally goes to the meetings and will generally demand that you have a non-employee or family member trustee on that board. Somebody maybe could be a retired banker or attorney that you worked with in the past, could be somebody who owned a similar business that you knew from another part of the country or something like that. But there's some governance that, you know, again, you have to get used to and weigh the cost benefit for yourself to see if you're okay with it. We have talked about some of this stuff before, but using it in exit planning, you know, it really does facilitate exit planning. You know, there have been a couple of ESOPs that we've done for our clients where, again, we did 30%. And the plan was they really wanted to have their employee involvement. They liked the idea of it. Yes, they got a little bit of liquidity from the transaction, but not you know, wasn't enough to retire on. They're still working. And then long term, they've got the flexibility of, okay, well, we still have control. We're still kind of running the company. We can decide to sell the rest of the company to the ESOP after that first 30% gets paid off. Or we still, you know, if we get approached or we want to go sell it to a third party for a bigger number, we can still do that. right? So it leaves some flexibility in there for how they want to deal with the company long term. But those benefits of doing an ESOP, the employee morale and involvement, and maybe they're working a little bit harder because now they see that it actually can mean something on the bottom line for them. That's a reason to kind of think about doing a partial minority ESOP at the beginning and leaving the rest for later to once you figure out what you want to do. We talked about this too. When you're selling your company, you want to get off the hook as much as possible. So you're typically able to finance some of this with a bank without a personal guarantee and get off the line of credit the personal guarantee you have on the line of credit. You have one at your business. So it kind of frees you up to where the only thing you're really left exposed on is that piece of seller note that you have out there with the company. Just a kind of a rough example of one that we worked on that was smaller. This kind of shows you that, you can under $10 million value business can be done. We just a while back did one for a company with a couple $1 million of EBITDA, not even. And the bank loaned, let's just call it an $8 million deal. The bank loaned about a quarter of that without any personal guarantees, and the sellers took notes. It was a couple of owners where one was really ready to retire. The other one was still kind of running the company. So it just kind of allowed for that whole thing to happen where the one guy could stay on, keep running it. The other guy who was older wanted to retire could kind of slowly step out over a 6 to 12 month period. And they're still on the board and all those kinds of things. It's just kind of smooth transition. Nobody, the employees get a little, it's a pop for the employees. It's usually a morale booster that now can kind of call themselves an employee owner of the business. Selling owners get some liquidity from the deal, and they're getting payments over time on their note that helps them with their retirement. Kind of a neat little deal of how these things work. We are 2 minutes over, but I will take any other questions.
There was one in my chat here. It says, do all selling shareholders have to participate equally in the sale to an ESOP?
So do all sellers have to participate equally in the sale? The answer is no. The individual shareholders are selling to an ESOP, to an entity, right? You're selling your stock, right? So it's not a redemption within the company. So if you've got five owners, they all own 20%, and you want to set up an ESOP and 2 of them are going to sell, the other 3 are going to keep it. Yeah, you could have the ESOP owning 40% and the other 3 people owning 20% each. Company goes on just like it had. Further questions? Seems like it's it. Thank you all for attending, and feel free to reach out to Robert or I if you want to follow up with a conversation or a meeting, phone call, whatever you want. We're happy to talk and help educate people about how these things work. They're a little complex, but a lot of times it can be the best answer for you.